Yeah, so today we have Dr. David Stovall. He is a PhD and professor in the Department of Black Studies and Criminology, Law, and Justice at UIC, the University of Illinois at Chicago. His scholarship investigates three areas. First, critical race theory. Second, the relationship between housing and education. And third, the intersection of race, place, and school. In the attempt to bring theory to action, he works with community organizations and schools to address the issues of equity, justice, and abolishing the school/prison nexus. His work led him to become a member of the design team for the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice, which opened in the fall of 2005. Furthering his work with communities, students, and teachers, his work manifests itself in his involvement with the People's Education Movement, a collection of classroom teachers, community members, students, and university professors in Chicago, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area who engaged in collaborative community projects centered in creating relevant curriculum. In addition to his duties and responsibilities as a professor at UIC, he also served as a volunteer social studies teacher at the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice from 2005 to 2018. I want to encourage you all to drop your comments and reflections in the chat as we listen, and we will have time at the end of our session around 7:30 to ask questions and discuss what we've heard. So without further ado, Dr. Stovall, the virtual floor is yours.
Indeed. Thanks so much, Megan. And thanks so much, Dr. Ford, for having somebody like myself in these spaces as the wars rage in Haiti, Sudan, Burkina Faso, and of course, Palestine. It is important, even with the ceasefire, it's important for us to recognize the struggles of people who are engaging in not just a fight for their lives, but also a fight for their humanity and the existence of people like them. So I want to thank again the team and Dr. Ford for having somebody like myself. What I want to do today is position a couple of things. And it's important to really kind of think about this moment. And I say this to you all as a critical race theorist, right? So even though a lot of us are hella mad about the current moment, it's been prophesized, y'all. Somebody been told us. The piece was, did we listen? And unfortunately, the answer was no, and hate won, right? So now we are living in an age where hate has won. So this thing now is a challenge for us to live in a particular way. And when I say that, it pushes us not to be hyper vigilant, but to be aware and ready. It is not if people are coming, or as my uncles would say, if them people are coming, it is when those people are coming. So now we must always be expectant of those folks to come, whether they be INS, ICE, Secret Service, Homeland Security, the Department of Education, right? So I think it's important for us to be prepared for what is coming towards us, but to not panic. And I think this is critically important because it's hard in this moment to delineate between the two, right? Because when folks like Trumpito Orange Cheeto has his thing for Chicago and he sends folks, he's sending them out of spite. He's sending them out of a anger that he saw resistance when he actually tried to have a rally at UIC in 2016, right? And folk forget about that, right? And that thing around when he tried to have that rally, folks in Chicago were like, yeah, homie, come through. We got something for you. I wish you would, right? And he hasn't forgotten that. So now we see in this moment these kind of vengeful attacks on folks. And then unfortunately, these vengeful attacks are often on people who cannot defend themselves when you talk about young children, when you talk about folks who may be elderly, people who may be infirmed. So now we're really talking about a moment that allows us to position a couple of things. Now, as the broader topic here is disenfranchisement, I want to put kind of a caveat and addition to disenfranchisement to really kind of think about racial capitalism and fugitivity, right? So as you all have these broad, I have folk talk about disenfranchisement and fugitivity, I want to drop racial capitalism in that because it is an argument that in this moment will become very important. And when we see Trumpito Cheeto, current president of the United States, make these particular assumptions, those really become important in terms of the interpretation, right? So the use of executive order is now the mechanism by which folks become fearful. So what we see in the United States, a lot of stuff shutting down, a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion programs shutting down before they're even sued, right? So now we have to really think about what does it mean to combat that fear and what does it mean to be brave? And do we have historical examples of that bravery where people have demonstrated a collective bravery? Because when we talk about fugitivity, it is important for us to remember that we are talking about a collective process. It is not individuated. And we often think about that, and that's wrong. It's wrongly taught to us about being individuated. But fugitivity is a collective concept. And the collective concept now is something that responds to disenfranchisement and racial capitalism, right? So let me just say something real quick about disenfranchisement because I think it's important to the overarching theme of the talks for this semester. And thank you again to the grad students in radical public health and Dr. Ford for your bravery in this moment, because a lot of folks are refusing to focus and they are folding. So thank you for your bravery. Thank you for getting down in a time where a lot of folks are shook. And I really appreciate that. So when we talk about disenfranchisement, what we're really speaking about is people being denied access to things that maintain life and well-being, right? And we wrongly position that in terms of disenfranchisement. We only talk about it in terms of voting. But you can be disenfranchised from anything, right? You can be disenfranchised from healthcare. You can be disenfranchised from education. You can be disenfranchised from other forms of doing and knowing. You can be disenfranchised from certain accesses. So now when we talk about that disenfranchisement, we have to think about what that process is. Now, as a critical race theorist, one of the things that becomes critically important, we have to get away from racism / white supremacy as these individual acts of bigotry. We have to understand racism as a structural phenomenon. So racism has a cumulative long-term effect on groupings of people. So now when we actually start to think about that, so does disenfranchisement. And disenfranchisement can come by way of white supremacy, right? And a lot of times when people say that, we wrongly get into this thing about bad actors. And I'm going to challenge us tonight to get away from the bad actor scenario to bad systems. So now if we get away from the bad actor, we now have to entertain what is a bad system, and a bad system that has never intended to do right by people. Now, again, I appreciate Epidemics of Injustice, Dr. Ford, because look, in a lot of places when you say that, you're automatically kicked out, right? You are uninvited to the party. But now it's important for us to be real about, can we ask the questions? When something has worked for oppressed people, does it happen because of the system or in spite of it? And that has always been the question. How do we think about these things that people have done to demonstrate their liberation, their commitment to freedom, their commitment to justice, not by way of those systems, but in spite of them? right? Using their tools sometimes to fight against that system that was never intended to do right by them. And then can we even think about those rules and regulations that people were not concerned about and begin to move fugitively on? Right. And I think this becomes an interesting conversation, right? So, disenfranchisement, meaning the denial of access, right? And the denial of access by way of policy. So, now, if we start with that, let's go further. Let's get into racial capitalism, right? And I think, folks, please read Cedric Robinson before you go somewhere, start claiming you know about racial capitalism. Read the dude who came up with the term, right? And then read Patrice Cully Stein, then read some Robin D.G. Kelly, right? Because these are the folks who are writing about this. And in this moment, it is going to be of critical importance that we turn to our commitment to political study, right? Because in an age of misinformation, we're going to be distracted in all these different ways. And the second author, Nancy, was Patrice Cully Stein. And she actually has a really important book on racial capitalism. So when we start to think about that in real ways, we now have to remember that we are in a proverbial fight, right? Now, again, it's provocative, but if we are not serious about this current moment and what's happening to folks, I don't really know what to tell you, right? I don't know if I could say anything beyond you have to prepare and act like you are in a fight. You have just been, if you stand for justice, you have just been kicked in the face. So now, what will you do in response? Now, that was not intended to be hyper violent. That was not intended to spurn folks away. But I want to put that analogy on folks because people think that the way to engage this is through temperance, and that's not it. And fugitivity tells us another lesson that because this is not a temperate moment, this is not a moment where folks can now expect systems to do right by when history has shown us that they were never intended to now do right by them. So what Cedric Robinson is refuting is a lot of his Marxist colleagues. A lot of Marxist analysis would say that race is an outgrowth of class because of its systems of division. Cedric Robinson complicated that. His understanding is that racism and classism are always in conversation with each other. It is not about whether or not one has birthed the other. It is always the ways in which the conversation is happening, and more importantly, how the conversation is rationalized. So now, many of you all who do justice-centered work across the country, you'll hear people say this thing to you, right? They'll say, well, isn't this about class? And you say, my response is always, it's about both all the time, right? And even more. So we're not just talking about class, we're talking about age, disability, sexual orientation. This now becomes a different conversation. And when we think about the ways in which racism and classism are having this conversation with each other and how it plays itself out along the lines of race, now we see these very factual points of data. We see these historical interventions by private entities and governments to further disenfranchise, limit, regulate, and in the most extreme cases, eliminate certain groupings of people. So now we have to think about this in particular ways. So Roxanne is exactly right. When people start to use race to justify capitalism. Now, what Cedric Robinson was saying, we have to look at how they were in conversation with each other. Now, let me put out an important argument here that a lot of times people use in terms of relationships to feudal societies and in terms of relationship to enslavement on the continent of Africa. Many folks will say that those examples, feudal Europe and enslavement on the continent of Africa, now dislodge theories of racial capitalism. And they don't. The most important thing is that we are talking about a fluid development. Enslavement in the Western Hemisphere had a very unique relationship to the social, political, and economic fabric of the moment. And when we talk about this in particular ways, we must also think about the rationale that Western Europe used in relationship to conquest. And this becomes important because when you talk about that conquest, they were not shipping. European folks came to the Western Hemisphere much later. When they were thinking about sources of labor and sources of free labor that they could negotiate to get from other African kingdoms, they made the choice to Africa because they also desired that particular land, particularly the Western Cape, right? As some folks would refer to as the Golden Cape, because that was what was in the Western Cape of Africa when you think about Benin, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, right? So now we start to think about this set of relationships. Cedric Robinson says we need to think about how the African was rationalized not as human, but as serviceable labor. And this becomes important because when we start to talk about this idea of enslavement, you first must put together dehumanization. This idea of someone being less than human and the fact that it's reflected in the Constitution, right? So this thing around, we often miss this point, and Cedric Robinson put us right to it and said, look, your evidence of racial capitalism is in the preamble of the Constitution. When African people were declared 3/5 of a human being, they were disenfranchised because if they were allowed to vote, they would run the state of South Carolina. Right? And this thing around really putting this in a broader conversation. So now we're no longer talking about this thing about racism being an outgrowth. They rationalize each other, right? They're always in this conversation, right? What is this control of the means of production when the means of production are human? So now we have to put this in a larger conversation. And more importantly, and I think this becomes critical in any conversation around racial capitalism, and Cedric Robinson, Patrice Culley-Stein, Robin D.G. Kelley, they always make this point. Black people have always resisted for time immemorial. And we erase that from history. And in fact, one of the largest revolts against racial capitalism actually happened in Haiti, right? And when we forget that historical point, we don't understand Haiti, right? And how the French government still feels a way about Haiti's resistance, right? And when we put that in space, because remember, Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture kicked the French out of Haiti, right? And what France made Haiti do for over 150 years is pay France back for lost labor cost. So when you talk about destabilizing a country, Haiti was never able to get economic footing because it was always paying France back. So now we have to think about this in a very different set of relationships. And when you see the quote unquote gang violence in Haiti, that's a structural colonial structure that was set up by people like the International Monetary Fund and France to further extract resources from Haiti, right? And to privilege the Dominican Republic for eliminating access to their side of the same island for a different group of people, right? Now, some Dominican folks get in a way about this. Other Dominican folks know what it is. So I am talking to the Dominican folks who know what it is, right? Check out a movie that Salma Hayek produced called A Season of the Butterflies. And she tells you that story around the Trujillo government, right? And the ways in which they limited access of Haitians to the Dominican Republic. Shout out to Salma Hayek for doing that. She doesn't get a love for that movie. So this thing around really putting this in relationship to life in the United States. And I would encourage folks to check out a text called The Half Never Told. In The Half Never Told, an economist actually goes through and creates a predictive model to actually show how much labor, free labor, was recouped and the value of that free labor in terms of from 1548 to 1863 in the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And what his predictive model has put forward is that we're talking about trillions of dollars. So those landowners, plantation owners, oil tycoons, railroad oligarchs made trillions of dollars off of the bodies of Black people and other oppressed folks, because you have to put in what happened in the Southwest to indigenous and Latine folks, what happened on the Eastern Seaboard and in the Great Midwest to indigenous folks, and Asian populations on the West Coast, right? I think it's important to be inclusive in that broader conversation. But The Half Never Told just looks at the Southeastern region, which was primarily where Black people were subjugated. So now when you put that in conversation, trillions of dollars actually were generated off of those Black bodies from 1548, where the first Spaniards landed in Florida, to 1863 and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So now we got to put that in conversation, right? So as my young folks always say to me, so Stovall, what does that mean right now, right? So what are the vestiges of racial capitalism right now? Like, where do we see this thing happen, right? Well, look no further than the prison industrial complex. Many of you all study this. Many of you all have seen this. And in the prison industrial complex, we see that the vast majority of people who are incarcerated in proportion to their population, disproportionate relationship to their population, are Black people. The growing population of incarcerated people are Black women. When you look at the ways in which people have been excluded from particular forms of employment by way of stereotype, innuendo, and abject denial, you now see what has happened to people. Poverty is not a culture. Poverty is a condition. And you all in public health know better than most folks. Our socio-ecological analysis will always show us that the condition is facilitated by something. So now we have to think about what facilitates this. So when we look at the disenfranchisement of Black farmers who were never allowed to get contracts to grow their crops, who actually lost their land to white land purveyors, when we see the concept of heirs property in the South, where there were no deeds to homes and next of kin were locked out of being able to have access to those homes. We saw that in 2005 in the Ninth Ward in New Orleans, right? We saw that in Houston in relationship to a couple of hurricanes in the 21st century. So now we have to think about in what ways have Black people been dislodged and actually cut off from access. Now, I want to flip this and get us into a conversation around resistance. And I really appreciate and thank you, Dr. Ford, and the folks for Epidemics of Injustice for talking about this. Because a lot of times people, I'm always fearful of when words become popularly used because they have these kind of sexy moments and then they kind of fizzle out, right? As a critical race theorist, I remember critical race theory's sexy moment, right? And then nobody wanted to talk about it. Then Chris Rufo said, well, this is the problem, critical race theory. And now people want to get it back in their head, right? Same thing with abolition. It has its sexy moment, and then people don't really know what to do with it because people haven't really talked about what it actually means. And thank you all for engaging a practice and process where we can actually get into what fugitivity is. Right? And put simply, fugitivity means that you are not yet free. There's something that still tries to contain you, that tries to bind you, but you have made a decision to set yourself free. You have made a decision to run. You are not running from something, but you are running to something. I borrow that from the education scholar Michael Dumas, who always reminded me that fugitivity means that you are not yet free. Freedom is still aspirational, but you have made a decision to move towards it. And you have now looked and said, in what instances do the rules not work? In what instances do the policies and structures have no relationship to me? And now, what will I do because of that incongruent relationship? What will I make plain because these systems have not worked? Right? And I come from this strategy and an experience. And I'll just kind of give you all an example of this. And some of you all have heard me tell, some of you all on the call have heard me tell this story before. So as a Chicagoan, my grandmother lived in a neighborhood that was referenced as Bronzeville, but Bronzeville is also known as the Mid-South. Part of Bronzeville had a nickname called the Gap, but it's actually four neighborhoods, right? Kenwood, Oakland, Grand Boulevard, and Douglas. So my grandmother moved to Chicago in 1938. She was one of the first families to live in the Ida B. Wells homes. And the Ida B. Wells homes is on King Drive between 39th and 36th, from King Drive back to almost Cottage Grove to about Langley, right? So my grandmother and the Ida B. Wells homes no longer exist. A lot of it is vacant lot, and then some of it has been transitioned into a mixed income housing development. So my grandmother grew up with she came up with a community of folks. She came from Arkansas. A lot of her neighbors were from Mississippi and Alabama. My mom's family is from Alabama, but the part of Alabama that's very close to the Mississippi border. My father's family is from Arkansas. So when she came up, there was this community of folks that she would engage with. And when she moved out of Ida B. Wells, she still kept in contact with that community. So it was my grandmother and her sister, my Aunt Alice. So my Aunt Alice was a baker, and she would always, have, and I'll come over the house, and I would love this. And please excuse my boomer moment for a second. I would go over to Auntie's house, and she would say, "Yeah, child, let me cook you some lunch." I'd be like, "Damn." Like a cooked lunch, right? And if anybody has experienced, K-12 lunches in a schoolhouse, when somebody says they're gonna cook you lunch, that is like a call from heaven. So when I first started driving, she just put me on delivery patrol. And she would say, "Yeah, child, I want you to go over to such and such, deliver this cake." So I would go deliver the cake, and the people that I would deliver all down King Drive. And the people that I would deliver cakes and cupcakes and pies to, they would give me back like a hammer. Right? They would give me back like a butcher knife, right? And I'll say to myself, like, damn, right? This like a cake for a hammer, a cupcake for a butcher knife. And it was a system of what economists call a system of barter, right? There was no money, there was never money exchanged. So now they had a network, and now people often refer to it as a mutual aid network to actually address people's needs. The question was, what do you need? And now here is the thanks for you getting me what we needed. And my aunt would just say, "Yeah, child, I just needed a hammer to go over. I forgot where mine was, but I knew Mabel had one. So I just sent you over there. Yeah, go ahead and get these cupcakes." Right. And you would often hear people talk about systems where money was never used. It was a fugitive understanding, right? People would say that the tender should be these dollars, but folks said, no, what do folks need? And I'm going to get it to you because you need it, right? It is a fugitive understanding because the rules don't work. All of us are out of money. So now, what do we do given the space, understanding that we're all out of the tender, i.e., cash, that's used for exchange by the larger world? And I think this really becomes important because although small, it is an example of fugitivity and how people lived in that fugitive space, not worried about what the system would do to them. Give you another example. My father and I once, this is one of my guys, his grandmother passed away. So I, in support of him, I went to his grandmother's funeral. My father comes walking through the door, and we're both looking at each other like, "Man, what are you doing here?" And he was like, "Oh, the sister whose funeral you at, she ran a reading house." And I was like, "A reading house? What was that?" He was like, "Look, man, schools were severely overcrowded. So it was hard for teachers to actually get the time, the one-on-one time in particular, for young folks who may have struggled with a particular subject. So she opened up her house and had an active library. People would come over to her house." He was like, "Man, I was like 8 or 9. I'd be sitting next to grown men and we would be exchanging books because she knew the need in the community for folks to read was the interruption to manipulation." So now she was teaching folks to read if they needed extra time in a schoolhouse or if they never had an opportunity to do it in a school setting. Again, fugitive, thinking about the ways in which we can do for ourselves absent of any reliance on the state. And I think when we start to think about those fugitive practices, it now allows us to see what's possible, right? So when young folks are talking about wellness and protection, that fugitivity is now saying, well, what is it that we need? And how do we get what it is that we need. Some of you all here in Chicago are familiar with an organization called the Let Us Breathe Collective. And the Let Us Breathe Collective was started in 2014 in a response to the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And what we saw and shout to all the family in Palestine, because what Palestinian folks did shifted the way in which this organization began to think about its work. When folks in Palestine saw that young people were being surrounded and the way they were being contained and the strategies that law enforcement were using to contain them, a group of Palestinian folks said, there's some things that you all need to pay attention to. You are about to be tear gassed. You're about to be contained in a very particular way. Here are the structures and strategies they will use to contain you. Here are the things that you need to get. And this is all over Twitter. And then they say to the folks in Ferguson, and remember, we love you. So folks in Chicago read those tweets and they said, well, man, folks in Ferguson need gas masks. So they went all throughout these spots in Chicago and collected gas masks and then drove down to Ferguson. And then they said to themselves, okay, we've done this. We've done this piece. We've been in this particular formation. Now what else is possible? And what does this mean to do it in a way that is addressing people's needs? And it was an interesting moment for me because the next time I saw them, it was at a concert, a benefit concert, and they had what was called a free store in the back of the venue. And it was just coats, hats, shoes. And I knew the faces of some folks. And I was like, man, I've seen y'all before. You know, what's going on? And I seen y'all at certain spots here in the city. Who are y'all? And they were like, yeah, man, we call ourselves Let Us Breathe. And this is the free store. I was like, damn, what? It was like, yeah, you know, and we don't have any regulation on it, you know, folks. Just take what you need. We just ask that people don't hoard. Take what you need. And there's nothing else that we ask, right? They weren't even asking for donations. They were like, look, just take what you need. That is the point of the free store, right? So now when you think about this fugitive space, again, let's go back to that point. We are talking about these things don't work for folks. We know folks don't have access to certain things like food, clothing, shelter. So now what do you do to get it to the folks who you know are in need of it? Another thing that the Let Us Breathe collective did, they posted up and did an encampment on the corner of Arthington and Homan. And for people who aren't familiar with that in Chicago, that is actually an unrestricted black ops site that was utilized by the Chicago Police Department over the last 40 years. And what happened in that site, people would be taken there and tortured, right? And then just kind of released to the street. You were never processed. You were never put into the system. But if they wanted to engage you and suppress you and torture you, that's where they would do it, right? And they did this for 40 years. As a young person growing up in Chicago, we would always have this fear about being caught up out west. It was like everybody would say, like, look, man, you don't want to be caught up out west. And what we thought, again, is coming up was just urban legend. Actually, these two white dudes in 2013 got caught at a WTO protest here in Chicago. They accidentally took them to Homan Square, kept them in there without any processing, let them out, and then they called the London Guardian. And a guy named Gary Young did the story, and he started talking to people out west, and people out west on the west side of the city just started saying, we've known that all along. So what the Let Us Breathe collective does They set up an encampment and call it Freedom Square. And it was a public education campaign to alert folks as to what was happening in Homan Square, right? So you had here in Chicago, we're not talking about extreme cases of rendition in the Middle East, North Africa, Central Africa, Eastern Europe. We're talking about rendition in the city of Chicago, where a building was used to torture people. So now, when we start to think about that in real time, that public education campaign was now a way to think about a couple of things. What do people need? How can we assess what people need? And then how do we create in the process? Another thing, and this is critically important about fugitivity. Fugitivity demands that we create. What are we willing to create? We know the need. We can assess the need. What do we create to further address that need? And now when we talk about it in that way, it allows for a different type of understanding. It allows us to process differently. It allows us to rethink our relationship with each other. And I think this becomes important because in this moment of madness under the Trump administration, we're now going to have to come to grips with this understanding. Only us is going to keep us safe. Only us are going to be the folks who do right by us because we understand what it is that we need. You will only get out of this mess by being in community with folk. And I think this kind of flies in the face of American exceptionalism, which kind of breeds this idea of the rugged individual. We have no evidence that that is what allows oppressed people to determine their liberation. And I say that in terms of being very honest about how I approach this, but also understanding that fugitive work is necessary work, right? And what does it mean? I mean, some of us have had fugitive teachers, right? Some of us have had teachers who say, look, the rules say we're supposed to be doing some madness around fractions. No, we're not doing that, right? we going in this direction. No, and they can come. I'll invite them into class, but trust. The assessment is, what do young folks need? How are we responsive to their needs? And then education accounts for not what they do now, but for what they do 10 years later. It's different, right? It's a different practice. And that's something that gets us away from these kind of arbitrary grading systems. It gets us away from this sorting of people, right? And it gets us away from predetermining by way of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So it challenges us to interrupt these things. So now, if we are interrupting white supremacy, if we are interrupting racial capitalism, now our sources of interruption are us, but it is fueled by our needs. And I think this becomes critically important because there is a movement to erase the things that I've talked to you about, right? There is a movement to get rid of any understanding of Black people, Indigenous folk, Latine folks, Asian Pacific Islander folks, commitment to liberate themselves, and then give you this kind of false umbrella of Americanism, right? This idea of discovery, this idea of manifest destiny, right? All of these things can now be used to charge me with some form of libel because I said it, right? But the thing is, now we have to be clear and responsive to the historical record. because these things that I've told you by way of my family story and what I've seen in the streets and who I've actually been in community with are real, right? These are documented spaces. These are what people have been doing. And now, in our attempt to figure out what the direction is moving forward, we now have to say to ourselves, what is the practice? What are the ways that we now lean on history and now think about what that means in the present? Because it's not just to rest on the laurels of history, it's actually to say to us, we are in this moment. This moment requires us to be very aware of the context in which we operate. Racial capitalism allows a lens to see the conversation between racism and classism. It allows us to now see where we rest in that conversation along the lines of racism and classism. It now allows us to say, well, what else are we in conversation with along the lines of age, gender, sexual orientation, sexual expression, disability, right? What does it mean to do this work intentionally, right? And if we do it intentionally, who are we doing it with? If there's one thing that I will implore for folks, do not lose the point that the resistance must come collectively. We need to assess who we are in community with. This is what this moment calls of us to do. We cannot run from that. That is a critical point because these are these communities of care are the spaces that are going to keep us alive, right? I don't want y'all to leave the talk tonight, it's just saying, Stovall said it's just all terrible. No, I mean, it's really, we're in a serious moment, of course. I don't want to miss on that point. But what I also want to say is that there is possibility, right? But you see that possibility when you're in community with folks. You see that possibility when you say to yourself, something is unacceptable. And because it is unacceptable, I'm going to do something different, right? And therein are the antecedents to abolition, right? Abolition just says, look, the thing that is unacceptable can't exist anymore. And now there's the greater responsibility to create what you need because that thing is unacceptable, right? And I think when we have those conversations in these basic levels, it allows us to understand the layers that are at play, right? We're talking about moving in a world that is banking on our distraction, right? So now we have to think about what allows us to make decisions clearly, what allows us to be in community with folks, what allows us to name the moment, right? So it's not fascism just as some slick, sexy word, but really this idea is that there is only one way of doing and knowing, and anything that opposes that way of doing and knowing will be crushed, suppressed, or eliminated. So now we have to have that conversation, right? And the conversation is not to further depress us. The conversation is to inform us so we know what we're in and we're not surprised when we see them activate. And I think this really becomes important. And when we're able to do that, it allows for a specific analysis to emerge. And that fugitive analysis allows us to ask, where do we go? Who is in that place that we are going? And what is our commitment to build that space into what it is that we need? right? I think we understudy maroon communities throughout the Caribbean and South America, right? So when you look at the Quilombo system in Brazil, when you look at the maroon societies in Jamaica, when you look at the resistance in Haiti, those were always spaces where the colonizer would dare not to go because they did not understand, one, the land. Two, they knew if they ventured into those places, they would be doing it on the terms of the people who decided to flee. And that was not a winning equation. So now we have to think about what is this work moving forward, right? How do we now begin to let the dust settle and not be overwhelmed by what we're seeing, but to say, if we understand this fugitively, now the first thing we can say is, oh, we've been here before, right? Trump to me is a remanifestation of a combination of Andrew Jackson and P.T. Barnum. We've seen this before, right? We've seen totalitarian regimes, right? Disguised as democracies. Nothing new. But we forgot. And because we forgot, there's the greater responsibility to dig back and remember, right? And I think that's an important piece, right? And I think, and I'll say this of my own self, right? As somebody who's in their 50s, my job is not to admonish young folks. My job is to figure out how to support them, right? Because I understand that my liberation is bound with theirs, right? I'm not going to free myself and then have the young bloods in bondage, right? That's just not going to work, right? So now we have to understand where our commitments are, right? And one thing that fugitive work reminds us is that it's sometimes a bumpy road, right? I want to be honest with folks, right? This doesn't have a lot of linear relationships, right? Sometimes it gets bumpy, right? And we have to figure out what are the processes of repair that allow us to move forward because this is bumpy, right? I have to call my own relationships into space, right? I have to figure out my own understandings of violence and harm and the ways in which I can enact those on people that I care about, right? And I think when we talk about that in relationship to this work, fugitivity is that response to disenfranchisement and racial capitalism. It allows us to envision something else. It challenges us to commit to work to build something else, no matter the scale, no matter the practice, no matter where it happens. But that is the challenge, right? And when you think about it in that way, I actually am encouraged by what we've seen. And some of the folks who are tuning in tonight from across the country, many of you all saw that Secret Service actually tried to come into a school on Friday. And a Hamline school, which is in a neighborhood called Back of the Yards, predominantly Latine, predominantly Mexican. And when Secret Service came to the door, essentially what the principals and teachers said was, fuck you, get a warrant and have a good day. And we have to have that same understanding. Yes, they are coming and they will come. How will we be prepared? What prepares us? And what is our commitment to being prepared? And I think when we start with that, it allows for a different set of realities, right? It's not one that claims expertise, right? It's one that says we are all learning together. We are all committed to one thing. Yes, there will be mistakes, but do not forget what we are trying to do, right? And I think when we are clear about that, right, it allows us to move in a way that is reflective of that clarity, right? And now we have a way to look in inwardly and outwardly in terms of what is viable and what people need. And I think that's an important piece when we talk about fugitivity, because it's not this ethereal word, right? I see fugitivity as a very practical word, right? It is a practical word that is rooted in an action, right? You have made a decision that something is unacceptable. You have made a decision that that thing is not working for you. You have made a decision that you will do something else. You have made a decision that the rules do not work. And because those rules do not work, you are in between, you are betwixt on the rules, right? And now you have to say, what is the need over what are the rules, right? And be prepared, when they come at you sideways because you dare challenge the rules, right? So this thing around really being clear about that, and how do we practice collective work? And I think fugitivity is a way for us to think about how we practice collective work, right? And do that in a way that builds on what we know from history and what we will unearth from our family stories, right? And now how we will move in those particular ways. And it is not something that is far away, but now it's with us, it's intimate. We have to start to think about what is the practice and how are we in practice with people, right? Because a lot of times people just think about this as kind of siphoning oneself off in practice, but it's really around how do we engage in this, right? We're talking about this, y'all, in a country where it was actually a crime punishable by death if somebody who looked like me learned how to read. Right? Let's just put that in context, right? What does that mean? Right? And why is that still a struggle to this very moment for folks who look like me to have quality education, access to health care, living wage employment? To this day, to this moment. So now we have to think about what it is that we're in, and does fugitivity allow us a path to rethink what it is that we're trying to do, right? It's not this thing around, you make this decision and now here's the linear path of fugitivity. It's really around saying, okay, here's what we're in. Now, what's available to me? What do I know how to do? Can I share that with others? Are there other people who are doing the things similar to myself? How can I join forces with them? Period. Right? And now you build out the work that you need. You build out the processes that allow you to make those decisions. And I think when you make those decisions, it's now a way to assess what's possible, right? And you're able to assess what's possible because you've done something, right? You're looking at what you've done, not just what you have just kind of imagined and kind of walked away from, but that imaginative work now becomes material work, right? And what is that material relationship? And Cedric Robinson, again, to shout him out, says there is a material relationship between race and class. It is something tangible. It is something that can be felt, seen, heard. And now, because of that relationship, we are now challenged to do something else. Right? So let me stop there, y'all. I'm much more interested in the questions that you all have. I apologize for running my mouth way too long. And for all y'all in public health, man, let me apologize for real, because I ain't even have no slides. Damn. I know y'all y'all like, what is happening right now? Dude, don't even have slides. No, can I see a picture of Cedric Robinson? My fault, y'all. That is entirely on me. I apologize for interrupting your pedagogical strategy that you are most familiar with. So let me uh say that. Appreciate you, Joyce, in terms of the chat. It's like, look, we out here. Um, so again, thank y'all for having me. I truly appreciate it. And I don't say that lightly because in this moment, we are going to need each other in ways that we have not imagined before. So I really am deeply, deeply appreciative for an opportunity to speak with y'all. And I'll stop there and we can open it up for questions. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stovall, for joining us. I know you already see people showing so much love in the chat and appreciation, but if folks could, keep that going. Also, if you want to use some little reaction emojis, if you want to come off mute and do a little hand clap or a woo, we welcome that as well. Yeah,
Woo,
we
woo,
just
woo, woo.
Hey, okay, I love that. So we just want to thank you again on behalf of the instruction team and the planning committee. Thanks for joining us in this class. And yes, and thanks for not only joining us in this class this year, but for folks who are new to E of I, you should know that Dr. Stovall is a consistent supporter of this course and regularly gives a lecture in this class. And we just so appreciate how you always bring like your fire and your energy and your very clear points and make these connections to the theme of the year and to this topic of racial capitalism. And we have a ton of comments and questions that came in through the chat.